it has been a traumatic time for you, and in some ways too, this is very much part of the world that you've written about, isn't it? This world churned by forces of all kinds, by the forces of nature and culture intertwined, often exacerbated by politics. This is, in some ways, your novel's coming to life.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Tom. I mean, I think Margaret Atwood really had it right when she said, you know, it's not climate change, it's everything change.
Yes.
And we see this now, you know, there's no going back to that world of before COVID times. We all recognize this now. Our bodily habits have changed. All our habits have changed. In New York City now, when we walk past each other, I see the ways in which we cringe and move away from each other, you know. So I don't think there's any going back on this, you know.
Yes, well, I agree. And we in Australia have been one of the fortunate countries, but here in Victoria, we had severe lockdowns last year, and we do celebrate at this festival the fact that we can meet together. It does feel like a miracle, a blessing at this time in world history that we can actually gather together. And we are meeting here. There's a lovely live audience here listening to you, and we meet in a beautiful room in a gracious city. We know how lucky we are. Amitav, I'd just like to take a moment to remind our audience here about some of your books and a little bit about your life. You were born in Kolkata and grew up in India, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And Amitav is the author of many spellbinding novels. And when you open one of his novels, from the very first page, it's like falling a free fall into another world. It's a vertiginous experience, I tell you. It's this sense of enrapture that envelops you, this giving of oneself to a master storyteller who takes you into another world, into a whole new sensory world, a world of the imagination, yet also one that is true, that is researched in meticulous detail, and that is part of the history of human experience. And I first discovered your work, Amitav, through the novel The Hungry Tide, which is dramatically set in the Sundarbans, the great mangrove forests of the tidal delta in the Bay of Bengal. It's a vast liminal world of salt and silt. And soon then I sought out his magnificent saga, the Glass Palace, set across a century in Burma, Bengal, India and Malaya. And then Sea of Poppies, which is about the Indian Ocean world's cultures and languages of the first half of the 19th century, and its sequels, River of Smoke and Flood of Fire, about the Opium War. And these novels are known as the Ibis trilogy, after the ship upon which the main characters meet and live, cheek by jowl. And so there are many other novels of Amitav's you must chase down and devour. And he's also writes entrancing and enlightening non-fiction. There's his Egyptian ethnography in an antique land. There's a collection of essays about Cambodia and Burma. And in 2016, the book we're going to talk a bit about in a moment, a remarkable book called The Great Derangement. I've got a copy here, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And in that book, he ponders the limits of the novel as a genre for capturing the disturbing reality of the environmental crisis of our world. And in many ways, I feel, Amitav, you took up that challenge in your next novel, Gun Island, which we'll also talk about. So here we have a book of non-fiction and a book of fiction, but both about storytelling and both about the disturbing here and now, but both also animating the deep history of the planet. So this is the realm that we really want to talk about today, isn't it, Amitav? And I'd like to sort of turn really to The Great Derangement, a beautiful and disturbing book, a book that you begin with a story of what happened to you on a day in North Delhi on March the 17th, 1978, when you're in your early 20s, I think a graduate student at the University of Delhi. Can you tell us about that day?
Oh, sure. But listen, Tom, before we go there, I think it's important to say, I mean, it's important for me to say that it's a wonderful thing that we are that I'm with you virtually in this beautiful room today, and that so many Australians can be there today. But we can't forget, that this, that this liberty that you guys have to be in large groups today has been purchased at the cost of, losses in other parts of the world. I think that's important to acknowledge. Large amounts of vaccines have been purchased by the Australian government. They've enacted incredibly rigorous rules, keeping out people from India, So I think we have to acknowledge that one of the things that I talked about in the book, in my book, The Great Derangement, is precisely this, which is the politics of the armed lifeboat. And Australia, above all, really exemplifies, a certain response to the planetary crisis, which is exactly the politics of the armed lifeboat.
One of the impressive things about your novels is the way in which you've already, I think, in your work, taken up the challenge you throw out in The Great Derangement about, can the novel capture the uncanny, the experience of the Anthropocene, the experience of living in a world that is churned by these natural forces constantly and at an accelerating pace? Can we capture this within the genre of the novel? And itself an invention, if you like, of bourgeois society, of fossil fuel society. This is part of the argument you're making. And when you produced Gun Island, one reads that, I think wants to read it with great derangement in the other hand almost. But also I found myself going back to The Hungry Tide. This has been a concern of yours from the beginning, hasn't it? And that's why I wanted you to tell the story of your 1978 experience, which seemed to capture, I think, some of the uncanny that you've wanted to give voice to.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, in 1978, what happened is that I was a student at Delhi University. And one day there was very weird weather, in where we were. I was in the library and there was this weird weather. And I thought, well, I'll go for a walk. I'll go and see this friend of mine. And, I left the library. I started walking. I went and saw my friend, who was maybe like 15 minutes away from the library. And then the weather was growing weirder and weirder. And then I came out and it was really weird. It was, this was like, I think April or something, and in Delhi, which is usually a time of just straight, flat heat, So I came out, I looked around, and suddenly I saw this strange thing. I mean, like a sort of finger reaching out of the sky towards me. And I had the good sense then to start running. If it had been today, I would probably have stopped and, taken a picture for my Instagram feed. I would probably be dead and wouldn't be here to speak of it. But I had the good sense to run away and, and take shelter and so on. But it was a very sort of profound moment for me because, as novelists, what do? We sit at our desks, we don't go out and about so much. And this was a very important event that happened in my life. And for years afterwards, I tried to write about it and I couldn't. And I realized at a certain point that the reason that I couldn't is because within the structure of a novel, within the structure of contemporary fiction, you can't write about those. You can't write about something that seems so incredibly improbable. There are structures of probability by which you are judged. So invariably it happens. I've seen this happen with so many of my books early on, that, the reviewer will read them and say, oh, this is so unlikely. There are too many coincidences. There are too many sort of improbable things happening in this book. And yet, you think about it, Tom, I mean, every important thing in our lives is improbable, unlikely, unpredictable. The circumstance that we find ourselves in today, to me, seems to be directly traceable to the 17th century. The 17th century and the expansion of Europe, the invasion of Australia, the invasion of the East Indies. It's just so striking, the similarities that link what we are in today and the 17th century.
Yes, well, I think you're right to make that connection. Australia, really as a modern nation is born of that expansion of Europe and of the conquest of Aboriginal lands, the taking of Aboriginal lands, and therefore a denialism is built into our very culture. And often I find myself trying to work out why denialism about climate crisis is so strong in this country. One of the frequent answers is that we have an economic dependence on coal, but I think it's much deeper than that. It's cultural. It's not just economic. It goes back, I think, to the fact that we are born of a moment of conquest, of a period of conquest, and denialism, if you like, has been built into our very soul. So it's not just, I'm afraid, that we are world leaders in the politics of the armed lifeboat. We're also world leaders, sadly, and it's becoming more obvious in climate denialism. So for me, it makes sense of the culture that we inhabit here. If we go back to the expansion of Europe, the establishment of European colonies in far-flung lands, the taking over of those lands, the turning of them into profit in a world global commercial system. So I feel that your book, The Great Derangement, is a real statement about the climate crisis. It's a crisis of culture. It's not only about carbon emissions. It's not only about the physical rupture in the atmosphere. It's not only about the biodiversity crisis. It also goes to the very fabric of our history.
And that's very interesting you say that, Tom, because actually Australia enters the picture pretty late. It's basically 19th century, whereas I think the real template for this was laid in the 17th and 18th centuries, and basically laid in the Caribbean, North America, South America. So what was really carried out in Australia, had already been, the template for it had been already laid by Europeans in North and South America, but most of all by English people. So I think it's very important to recognize that it's the Anglosphere, above all, that is so profoundly invested in this idea of extraction, of extractivist economies in a certain way. And that goes back to all the leading philosophers of the Anglo tradition, whether we talk about John Locke or Francis Bacon or whatever. They implanted within English minds this whole idea that the world exists only to be extracted from, and it's not just material resources, it's also people. So you extract not just from the land, but also you extract from American Indians, but equally from Africans, who you take in vast numbers, to the Americas, and who you subject to the most appalling sorts of exploitation. And, because Australia occurs later, because Australia and New Zealand occur later, the patterns are somewhat different. But I think we see the clearest playing out of these patterns in the Americas in the in the 17th and 18th centuries. I think we are basically reliving the 17th century today.
And that's really what Gun Island is about, I think. Let's turn to Gun Island, your 2019 novel, which really does bring the 17th century into 21st century life, doesn't it? The narrator is Dean Datter, who is an antiquarian bookseller spending time between America and India. And Dean is, in the first opening chapter, finds himself propelled by mysterious forces, one could say, from his comfortable life of books into the sea and salt and mud of the Sundarbans, and suddenly literally finds himself struggling to get a foothold in mud in a great quest. Can you tell our audience how that happens? What is he looking for?
Well, he ends up looking for this temple that's lost in the forest. And look, I think in the most basic sense, what I was trying to do in Gun Island was to try and answer, I think, what is the fundamental challenge that confronts storytellers of all stripes today, which is how do you give voice to the non-human, How do you restore the voice of the non-human? And that's actually was so interesting to me in these books that you sent to me of Alice Duncan Kemp, because you see the strained relationship of the colonizer, and there's no way that one can whitewash, as it were, her very colonizing gaze towards indigenous Australians. It was a very colonizing gaze. And at the same time, she can sense that they see something in the land, that the land speaks to them, that the land and other beings speak to them in voices which are real, and she apprehends the reality of those voices, So, when we look back on this, history, that is what is really interesting. How was it possible for a small group of 17th century elite European intellectuals to persuade us that, humans, and not all humans, only white male humans, really were agents, had, that only they had agency, had reason, had historical agency, and the rest of the world was inert and brutish, I think that's really the question that we have to ask today.